Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Janet C. Gilmore's University Students, Foodways, and the Immigrant Process. I really loved this article. This is a new one for me. You might be wondering where it sort of comes from in like that introductory paragraph. This is where she says, "The return of traditional food catches the imagination but proves a conundrum for this folklorist." This is her contribution to the 19th International Ethnological Food Research Committee that took place in Lund in 2012. And so, again, because she's a very good folklorist, the first thing that happens is that when someone says traditional, as if it's a given what that means, she goes, not so tough, not so fast there, mister. And she asks the very question about what is traditional. Because, like all things, like all folk cultures, foodways is in constant emergence. And the idea of traditional is something that is affirmed by the participants themselves, but is not necessarily, in fact, I don't know why I said not necessarily, but is not a quantifiable, objective reality. Traditional is the idea of tradition is always the contemporary idea and rediscovery and reformulation and reframing of the past. So when a sentence or a clause like the return of traditional food is introduced, you really need to sort of like step that up a couple of notches and say, okay, it is the turn towards the idea of traditional being a value that we are going to associate with the very contemporary foodways that we are engaged in right now. And so she sort of tests this very idea, and she makes this really fascinating comparison between the experience of immigrant communities and the experience of university students. And her focus is mainly on university students. And she's using the insights that people like Linda Daig and the Lockwoods and Glassy and a whole bunch of people have brought forward about how to sort of understand I don't want to say acculturation process because that sounds like something that they have to go through, but what happens to immigrant communities and how they negotiate the desire to be part of this new place while also this desire to perpetuate and continue the old, and both of which are active, both of which are positive goods, and yet are always going to be in this a mediated flux. And so she uses the insights to discuss university students, and I think that's kind of fascinating. And she does it at her home university, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which from a Canadian perspective is ridiculous. It's a huge university by Canadian standards. Maybe by American standards, it's just like big, but not unimaginably enormous. And certainly by maritime Canadian standards, it's a very large, 40,000 students, and comprises a significant population of an urban center. It's not like a university town situation where very small community and then the university has this sort of overarching presence in it, something like a Wolfville or Antigonish for Acadia and St. Francis Xavier, respectively. This is that kind of prominence in the community, and yet city size as opposed to town size. So, just for at least Atlantic Canadian students, just to wrap your head around that might be might take some doing. And she has this based on her food journal projects that she's been doing for a number of years in both foodway specific courses and in general folklore courses. She comes up with this sort of really interesting model. And again, it's not a typology. It's a loose structure for some kind of analysis. It might not hold up to irreducible scientific scrutiny, but I think it's a ridiculously fruitful way of understanding this process, especially for people like me and my colleagues who are interested in adolescent and university folklore and folk life to begin with, I was like, okay, I can sort of see the parallels that go through. So she has this sort of 5-tier model, and this is again projected on by the students themselves on their own experiences. It isn't, and so she's sort of generalizing here, where you have this first stage, this mythological childhood. And I like the idea of the mythological, but sort of this, through rose-colored retrospective glasses, seen as this kind of pristine time. But clearly, it's also the time when the individual has very little exercise of liberty over their food choices. They are part of their family's decisions. Every food choice is basically made through the largesse of someone else. The second stage is the experimentation that happens as one is a teenager. More or less think of it as you have allowances and you have a freedom of movement to walk around, or perhaps even later on drive around your community and take part in, procure your own food. But often it's again through fast food establishments, it's through the popular culture and so on. But nevertheless, it is something that is different from the food of home, whether it's the food literally of home or the food that is provided to you through restaurants, but at the decisions of the family. Then there's this third stage, which is kind of a variation on the second stage, if you think about it, but it's also kind of a variation on the first in a really sort of interesting way. And that's the, I can't remember the term that she uses for it a lot, the destabilizing first-year college experience. So she's going on the assumption that at the university experience, that most people have moved away from their home. So she's basically talking about people who are not going to university in their home communities, and so they do not have the context of their family in the everyday. In the everyday, they are not living in their family dwellings. Most of the time, they're going to residence. That seems to be the preponderance. So they're in the university residences, and so they don't have they're exposed to a remarkable amount of choice through the contemporary university food hall, which are doing their best to accommodate choices and ranges and health initiatives and lifestyle choices and tastes, and kind of reproduce options that clearly are not available in the family home, and yet are done from an institutional level. And so it's going to be regimented through things like university caterers and so on. But you can go to town on it. You can gorge. You have these meal plans that you might be able to participate in. But it's not that much different from the limited liberty of being in the childhood home. Then you also have the sort of stage 4, and again, these are loose things. Stage 4, where you have the shift to off-campus eating, and the experimentation that comes from there, from not dictated by the universities, what the university offers, but by one's own choices. And that happens in the first year, and then subsequently when one moves off of campus and one starts to then have to be responsible for one's own food. And so not simply in the matter of getting it from establishments, but also for a number of reasons, having to start to accommodate and becoming a maker of food. Learn to live in a kitchen. Again, these are generalizations. Many of us had childhood experiences and responsibilities in terms of preparing food for the family. I was making meals for my mother when I was like 12 and 13. So she is speaking in generalities to begin with. But even when you are when you are part of that food making process in the home, you might not necessarily be exercising your own choices and privileges, and those choices and privileges haven't necessarily had the range of experience of living in the outside world and trying to bring those tastes into the home. You are more or less reproducing domestic tastes at that time. So there's that. And then the fifth stage is what happens when you are no longer, when you start to sort of create new, more formal affiliations and families and so on. Basically, not when you grow up, that isn't the right word, but when you start to be, enter into relationships where you are interdependent, or you start to have people who are dependent on you. And so primarily you have, you now exercising choice, but on behalf of others. And in a way, that's when the cycle continues. And at first, you have to be accommodating, and then subsequently you are in the process of creating the new formation and the new benchmark for that subsequent generation, who will assume that your foodways, the foodways that you have discovered over this time, or you matured into, and she uses the word maturation, which I think is wonderful. The foodways that you have matured into are going to be their new normal, and they're the ones that are going to be eventually rebelled against. So her sample is, as we can expect perhaps from North American university experience, basically upper and middle class, basically white, Midwestern, because of Madison, Wisconsin, university students. But there's still a range of experiences. There is, first of all, people who fall outside of that kind of lump category in the middle. African American, Latinx, First Nations, Hmong. There's a large Hmong community in the area. Are coming from various parts of the Midwest with various regional foodways european and even if they have largely of white European background, there is diversity within those, and diversity both positive and in terms of sort of stigmatized communities there. And then there are people from outside of that region, from large metropolises. She identifies New York in particular. And again, it's not conjecture. She's talking about students who have been in her class. And some are international students, because it is a major research university. And so you'll have people from around the world. And she identifies Java and in India, places that have often been, and for centuries have been, multi-ethnic communities. Ethnic in that sort of loose sense of the word. And many of them have agrarian family heritages or relate to some kind of ethnic identity. Many of them, they still have extended families in terms of grandparents' generations, all of which are markers for this concept of tradition. And again, where tradition is not some objective reality, but when people start to frame their food traditions, of their food inheritances, they might think of them as traditional in part because they are logged into a generation of a couple generations above them, or they're logged into the agrarian and the rural, or they're logged into a sense of being part of a visible minority. Again, scare quotes, please use it. I love this term that she has. These are parallel terms, these conscious ruptures and these unheralded continuities, where the journals show that the experiments with the new, the experiments with the novel, trying different things, are part of that sort of maturation process. But the journals also evidence, without necessarily adverting a huge amount of attention towards, the fact that they are nevertheless perpetuating. Perpetuate's always a terrible word. It sounds like, as one perpetuates a prejudice. But they're in continuity with the past as well, continuing those things that are found meaningful for them from generation to generation. And she has this other idea, which I think is really great, where she talks about the sort of creolization of students, where basically you have, when people like Daig and Lockwood have talked about, and the Lockwoods have talked about, the formation of ethnic communities, and I use that strange emphasis on the word, where ethnic is this sort of othering that is done by a mainstream of people who come from a particular region, and they are homogenized into a block. And the homogenization is sometimes inhabited by the individuals themselves. And manifested in the individual themselves. So whereas back home, in your home community, you might sort of find yourself much more by your town or your bay or your county or your sort of small little regional identities. And yet when you're confronted with the mainstream, in a new immigrant community, when you are in a at least mathematical minority, the differences that you might bring over start to become erased, because they're erased by the welcoming population. They seem to be erased, and you start to erase them yourselves for a number of reasons. And so in a way, she's talking about how you can think of that in terms of the student population, where the students are coming with a whole bunch of identity markers, that one of which is university student, but also a place of gender, of gender identity, of sociocultural background, of interest, of all the sort of various things that we might think of in a folk, and as one of the multiple common factors that people have in terms of folk group. And then they show up and they are lumped into this idea of student, and they are lumped into this idea, this sort of like monolith of the students, and they're done so by the community that they find themselves in, the citizens of Madison, and potentially by the university itself. No matter how much the university celebrates diversity, there's a certain aspect that treats them as a block. There's a whole bunch of stuff about the creation of student identity, where sometimes you're just limited to, the whole point of like a Frosh Week is to reduce you to nothing but a student of this place, at least for that week. Erase your prior identity, and then at the end of the week, the complexity starts to build up. But that is a conversation for another day. So, she points to some of the analogies, the context from home, or analogies to the immigrant experience. And one of them is simply this disjuncture, this movement away from one's home community for positive reasons, for the positive associations that students have with this particular university, or if one wants to generalize a bit more in this model, the positive associations of going to university and going away to university, whether the going away is a value in and of itself, or the going away is the price one pays for going to a particular institution to follow a particular course of studies. And so, finding oneself alone, away from one's home community. And often with the second idea, the sojourner, of being it being temporary. The idea of it being just for an extended period of time, but not permanent. It's different from the, there are immigrant communities where sometimes the nature of the immigration is basically to go and to, perhaps earn some capital and then move back. So even though students might end up living in the Madison, Wisconsin area, nevertheless, they might not move there with that intent. So this idea of sort of the being temporary citizens of this place is one of those things, and never necessarily feeling the utmost need to assimilate. It's similar to the concept of the extended stay tourist. So certain populations and international students comprise one of them. Missions and missionaries can comprise another. Diplomats can comprise a third. People who are going to go to a place and live within that community for far longer than the typical tourist, and yet not necessarily on an integrative way like the immigrant would, and so are there for maybe as long as 2 or 3 years, but an extended period of time. And they can't necessarily sustain that fascination with otherness that the tourist does, but neither are they in this process of assimilation that an immigrant identity might be desirous of undergoing as they do so. One of the other analogies, which is sort of remarkably tight, is the fact that they often are living in university residences, similar to how often, at least in the history of early immigration to the Midwest and to parts in Canada, the immigrants, when they moved, would live in sort of tight-quartered boarding houses, especially people who were coming not through family, but the single solitary immigrant, especially those for whom they were there for work. They lived in basically boarding houses, tight, cramped situations, high density, which is not that much different from the university experience themselves. Or they'd live in, for lack of a better word, working class ethnic neighborhoods that were proximate, and again, through like boarding houses and so on, that were proximate to the center of employment. University students might live in like a student ghetto, either in their first year or soon thereafter. Probably they will start to move there as well. But at the same time, they also start modeling their behavior based on older students, especially when they start going out into the community, and they perhaps very soon, but probably at least by second year, when they've moved out of residences, they're students who've been there a couple of years longer and have a better lay of the land, and they start to, as I said, model on this group. And it's the point where they start intermingling, and they're exposing, because they are all singular from their own experiences, and then they start intermingling with other singular people, and that intermingling is part of the university experience. So in this quote, nevertheless, they mingle in socially similar ways to new immigrants in immigrant ghettos, encountering differing habits, including food-related ones, as they become acquainted, dine, and take classes together, make new friends, and adjust to the new environment. They start to reject the institutionalized food of food halls and so on, even though it's not free, but it can be eaten almost without thought because it's attached to a meal plan. Nevertheless, they can go out into the community and start experimenting with this infrastructure in the student ghetto, the food swamp, or that are specifically there to accommodate this student group, others as well, but particularly this student group. And so they're going to coffee houses, and they're going to ethnic cuisine, and they're going to all these places that are catering, and the kind of culture that builds up in university towns. And sometimes you can make an argument that they're sort of predatory, but at the very least that they are there to meet the needs of this community that is interested in experimenting, and one of the ways that they are interested in experimenting is experimenting in new foodways. This time is often in retrospect, and again, this is through the food journal exercise. In retrospect, it's often regretted, in large part because of I could have been saving my money, and the food hall was paid for, and yet here I am eating ice cream and coffee all over the place. So not so unhealthy and financially regrettable. But you can make an argument that it is nevertheless one of those important stages of full experimentation and finding out what one is interested in, and it's also integral, and because it's one of the few infrastructures that's available for the building of the new communities, building of new friendships, cementing these new social networks that you are making independent of your home networks. Eventually, most people shift out of residence and they start moving into in off campus, and this is where they no longer are subject to the in loco parentis of the university. But they need to start figuring out how to feed themselves, something they hadn't quite thought of before. Especially when they are now surrounded, they emerge, and they often, and again, we can note the exceptions, but even those exceptions, they might not necessarily have the full panoply of skills required to feed oneself. So even if you have been making food as a child, that might not necessarily make you a good grocery shopper or a good meal planner. You just might be an accomplished sous chef in the domestic kitchen. And again, There are exceptions, but we're talking about larger patterns, and so I think the patterns hold up quite well. So the idea that food needs to be procured and prepared is one of those issues. Sometimes people find cheap or free food options. I always tell students that students should go to absolutely every lecture that they see. Why? Because those lectures are inevitably catered, and if you, at the end of the meeting, at the end of the lecture, there's always going to be leftovers, and even the most miserly university professor, if they see a starving student eyeing those sandwiches, that university professor is not going to take away that platter and, hey, you have free sandwiches. Not to mention the fact that you're going to listen to a lecture and you're going to have some kind of new information and cutting edge research spoken to you, as opposed to the blarney that you get from people like me. So there's a free tip, kids. Go to all lectures and you might never have to pay for food again, because those sandwiches will last a couple of days, at least until the next lecture is kicking around. I digress. Yes, so some procure food through dumpster diving or coming up with strategies, or soup kitchens. She doesn't talk about this, or food banks, which is another very real reality of contemporary university students. Free tuition now. And some, by learning how to cook for themselves. And with this latter group, it typically, talking generalities, it typically starts with a sort of simplified version of the foods that they make at home, because they're sort of the poor foods, maybe the foods that they prepared for themselves as sort of latchkey kids when they came home. Simple ingredients, simply procured, and often they establish or reestablish contact with their home communities. Like literally calling their parents on the phone. How do I make this thing? What am I doing? And being talked through it. And then slowly they start to, and that becomes the baseline. This is how I'm learning to feed myself. Just wonderful quote at the bottom of 247 and over onto 248. Within these contexts of recreating selected familiar basics at first, most move on to new territory, testing ideas that they have seen reproduced by friends or on TV, or that they have encountered in restaurants, community food activism, cookbooks, and on the internet. A few report romances with new equipment like food processors, blenders, and toaster ovens that inspire experimentation with new foods and recipes discovered through student social experiences and newfound vegetarianism. So it's in this process, this new process of experimentation and discovery, that they start to develop their own sense of self, their own ways of engaging in their newfound identities. They're merging into these processes of maturation, and they are engaged in syncretism. They are engaged in this process that is, again, very similar to the immigrant experience in terms of taking the new things that are now open to them and available to them, and are displays of cosmopolitanism, the very thing that many people are going to university to try and achieve, while simultaneously being the familiar. And one of the ways that it's in the familiar is that they tend to repeat the patterns that have been set forward. The allocation of meals. Remember earlier she had that concept of where the sort of disguised continuities, the things that were different are noted in the student journals, but the things that are consistent and the things that are being brought forward are the same, but go unnoted. And one of the things that happens is the patterning of the week, the very way that the meals work out. And she has this beautiful expression. The idea of the Monday to Thursday, like a bifurcated week. The Monday to Thursday is the Spartan everyday grind, because of classes, because of jobs, because of sociability, or the lack of sociability, because other people have jobs and classes. Food is basically fuel. Meals are efficient. Meals are not times of commensality in the same way that they might be at other times. And similarly, you can think about the food that you might have in your own home, your family home, that Monday through Thursday, even if they are prepared with love, they're not necessarily prepared with ceremony in the same kind of way. Friday through Sunday is the festal time. The schedule is more fluid. meals can be fuller, meals can be richer, meals are much more about social occasions, and things can be processed in that way. So new experiences can be had, and that is one of the times when experimentation and display can happen. She has this wonderful quote on 248. Students offset the losses of the work week with excesses on the weekend, and these weekends are when they often work socially on emerging new food identities in communal cooking, dining, or food exchange, with occasional relapses to home-based identities while visiting with family members and old friends. In making time to cook, feast, and visit, students not only perpetuate social matrices of foodways, but cultivate exchange and friendship. Even while creating and sampling new foods within this context, the students often experience or recreate familiar meal strategies, and especially potluck meal formats in complementary foods, display, consumption, and cleanup. So then she concludes, and her conclusion is basically a recapitulation of what she's saying already, that there is a lot that can be learned from the immigrant experience to understand the university experience. Conversely, perhaps there's something to be learned from the university experience that can be applied to the immigrant experience. But what I really love about this article is the sort of slight bit of shade that she's throwing. And I wonder who it is. I have a feeling it might be one of those things that academics sometimes do where they know exactly who they are referring to. They might not even know, they might not even think that the person who is going to be reading it is ever going to read it. Or the person it's directed towards is ever going to read it. But it's like, oh, this is a conceit that I just need to poke at. And it goes back to the first paragraph, the very first paragraph of the article, where she says, where she's talking about the university students' food, and she says, describes it as a demographic often perceived by faculty and university staff as knowingly abusing or not having or knowing good food practices. And clearly she has someone in mind, someone who is denigrating students and their food. Whether the food that they eat in the cafeteria, whether the idea that they are always around the student ghetto and populating, whatever kind of mockery that they are putting on the food on the students. And I think, and I am just projecting, and she can correct me, but I think she might be, and I think at the very least one could make this conclusion, whether that is the one that she's making or not, is that to dismiss and to denigrate and deride student food experiences is analogous to denigrating and deriding immigrant experiences, immigrant food experiences perhaps specifically, but immigrant populations in general for not having acculturated yet. So in the same way that one might mock or hold up as dangerous or hold up as foolhardy the food traditions of a conspicuous ethnic population, or their language, or their failed English, or their mode of dress, or whatever. All the ways that the privileged classes can keep people at arm's distance by mocking their customs and mocking their foodways, and basically suggesting that their failure to assimilate, or rather their failure to yet assimilate, is something that holds them in a certain form of contempt, is similar to what's happening with students. And the idea is that students are in this process of maturation, which is why I like her use of that term, that these are stages in development, and to deride someone for yet having hit the later stages of development is cruel. And it's callous. And it wouldn't be much different, and again, bring it back into the university perspective, of deriding a student for not yet having sort of the full mastery over their academic discipline that a faculty member has or ought to have. And it's sort of this but that's what they're there for, or at least that's what they are potentially there for. And so we wouldn't mock a student for not yet knowing something when it comes to the things that we know very well, because they are our life work. Why would we denigrate a student for not yet knowing something about how to be a contemporary, mature food person that we have had? And remember, the people that she's referring to are in positions of staunch privilege, like myself, in terms of having had a life of enough liberty to pursue this very obscure occupation of academic. Plus, it's not the best paid in the world. Talk to your elected officials, but it is better paid than everyone else, and it's a comfortable middle class existence that the students wouldn't necessarily be coming from. So it's already through so many lenses of privilege. So I think she is talking to an international audience here in Sweden, and in international Congress, and they probably all do have their jokes about the student life and student experiences and student gluttony and student foolhardiness and so on. But it's like, okay, maybe you can look at these food processes, and the students themselves are looking at them from the point of fourth year. They're looking at their first year experiences like, oh my God, what was I doing? But through those processes, they were in that stage of becoming. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And that's why this article transcends the very idea of just simply being a study of university foodways. It's a study of how people come to be engaged in food and develop their own habitus of food. I think it's quite remarkable. So Gilmore does the traditional sort of, this is just preliminary findings, but I love her conclusion. This preliminary development of parallels, findings, and generalizations suggests that the college student experience of heightened food dynamism and adventurism is variable, while it builds on the destabilization that takes place as teenagers move away from family, the familiar, and symbols of parental authority, towards peer group preferences, approval, and differentiation from home-based food patterns. So it's part of the process. It's the process of going from the simple blind acceptance of the tradition, and again, this is all a problematization of what traditional is, to a re-embrace and a discovery of what one actually wants. And one of the things one actually wants is bringing things back from the past, is bringing things back from one's childhood. But it isn't a simple reproduction of it. It is the end point of a process of developing that competency and fluency in one's own food habits. That's why it's a great article. Anyway, we have been discussing Janet Gilmore's University Students, Foodways, and the Immigrant Process. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, eat well, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.